By the way, I've just realized. I don't even know your name.
Smith. Dr. John Smith.
Hello everybody and welcome back to today's brand new video where I'm going to be giving you guys a kind of retrospective overview look at the third Doctor's era, the Jon Pertwee era, which ran from 1970 to 1974. Now you'll probably have seen my reviews have been a bit all over the place, up and down, not that many really ultimately. Some of you may know who've been watching some of my Classic Who reviews will know I've been marathoning the show since early 2018. From the very beginning I'm intending to at least go through the whole Classic series, maybe eventually through the whole of the New Who as well. I've recently finished the third Doctor's era, and so it felt it was time to do another one of these retrospective videos like I've done previously. But of course, I know I haven't really done as many reviews, I just haven't really had the same opportunity to do them for the Pertwee era. So that's why I got up to Terror of the Autons, and then it's kind of just been nothing until this video suddenly. So I hope you guys don't mind it too much, and I'm sure at some point in the future I will go back and watch those episodes or stories again, and I will do proper reviews of them for you two guys to enjoy at some point in the future. So yes, I started my journey with the third Doctor about 9 months ago. I think it was June last year, or so 9 months to a year ago or so that it took me to watch his whole era. It is an era where I think I've pretty much seen every single story at some point in the past. And I would probably have said, at least certainly beforehand, that it was my favourite era of Classic Who. I've just always had a real soft spot for the Earth-based alien invasion type stories, the whole unit era sort of family and vibe around the series, the introduction of the Roger Delgado Master as well, and just Jon Pertwee's Doctor has meant it's always been an era that I've been very, very fond of and very much a favourite of mine. So it meant that going into it, I was very, very much looking forward to watching this whole era sort of, certainly for the first time in the right order, all over again. And certainly for me, the Pertwee era did not disappoint once again on rewatch. I feel like this era, essentially the whole of 1970s Doctor Who is probably some of the most consistently good periods of Doctor Who we've ever seen throughout the history of the whole show. There's just so many brilliant stories throughout it. Of course, I'm focusing on the Pertwee era today, but I'm very much looking forward to watching all the Tom Baker era and filling in the last few gaps of episodes stories I haven't seen before. But yeah, just the whole package, there's just so many good stories. Every series has several excellent stories that are so memorable and well known in the fandom, and it's just such a great era to be able to rewatch, I think. So we'll work our way through and start with season 7, which of course introduced Jon Pertwee as the Doctor, the biggest change the show has really ever seen. It went from black and white to colour. We went from Patrick Troughton to Jon Pertwee. We changed the whole behind the scenes production team as well. Derek Sherwin oversaw it, but then from the second story onwards we had Barry Letts and Terence Dix taking over as the sort of producers and script writers and script editors of the programme, and it just meant it was a completely different vibe for the programme because you also had Jon Pertwee's third Doctor being exiled to Earth after he had been forced to regenerate, and he's then automatically exiled to Earth, and we spend most of the first, certainly basically the whole of the first 3 seasons, apart from a couple of stories here and there, where the Doctor is stuck on Earth and they're Earth-based stories. We've had the trial of UNIT in The Invasion back in 1968, I think also 69, in the previous couple of seasons, just to kind of set up that family for the Doctor to be able to go into in 1970 in season 7, which was very, very important to set out because otherwise there would have been no real purpose or means for the Doctor to be on Earth, and it would have been a bizarre, disjointed affair of stories. So the idea of UNIT, and I think introducing that, was so, so critical to make this new idea and era of the programme work.
Open the capsule.
We are not cleared for re-entry.
Charlie, we're back at Space Control. What's wrong? Open the hatch.
Hello, Space Control. This is Recovery 7. Will you clear us for re-entry?
Let me try. Hello, Van Leyden. What is the capital of Australia?
We are not cleared for re-entry.
How many beams make 5?
Hello, Space Control. This is Recovery 7. Will you clear us for re-entry?
Van
We are
Leyden.
not cleared for re-entry.
Right, cut it open.
Now, of course, in many ways, it's quite a challenge to create Doctor Who that is purely Earthbound, because it very much limits the amount of stories you can tell, because they've all got to be related to Earth. And I'm sure you guys have seen the anecdote before, but the anecdote from Terence Dicks, that he suddenly realised that you've only got 2 stories when you're on Earth. It's mad scientist or alien invasion. And ultimately, Doctor Who and the writers prove they can be more creative than that, and we do see a few different stories. Just think of something like Doctor and the Silurians, which is very much a story about the aliens were here before us, and a sort of moral dilemma of who really owns the planet, should we be killing each other or whatever. It's a very, very interesting story. And the parallel universe idea that you did in Inferno as well, it's just nice to have those few different elements explored that shows that Doctor Who isn't such a limited formula, even if it's Earthbound completely. And so season 7 is pretty much completely Earthbound. We start from Spearhead from Space, when the Doctor is regenerated and arrives on Earth, set with the introduction of the Autons for the very first time as well, a villain that becomes very, very well known to the show, of course. This isn't a video where I want to go in depth on every single story, but just sort of setting out the context around things and just some general overall opinions. And I think season 7, which has Spearhead from Space, about the Doctor and the Silurians, Ambassadors of Death, and Inferno, is probably for me my favourite overall season of Doctor Who, full stop. Those 4 stories, I think, are all absolutely excellent. They really are so well written, such great ideas behind them, such a brilliant team of people and a cast involved with the stories, that it just creates such an excellent and brilliant vibe that I thoroughly enjoy. I think even Ambassadors of Death, which I know is sometimes a little bit of an up and down story, for me it's been always one I've had a real soft spot for, and one I've just really sort of enjoyed. Maybe a bit sillily, but I've always really, really enjoyed. I think it's a season that is very much kind of out on its own. It's got quite a bleak outlook on things. It's quite, to some extent, quite a heavy story, a heavy season, with some very heavy the moral dilemma of Doctor and the Silurians, some quite sort of evil shenanigans in the Ambassadors of Death, and some very kind of gritty, quite sort of washed out colouring, even things like that in some of the location filming in particular that you think of in something like the Ambassadors of Death, compared to what we get in season 8 straight away with Terror of the Autons, that's very bright colours and vibrant. It feels like it's a very kind of dark and grittier series in season 7. And then of course in Inferno, where the parallel universe is destroyed and everybody dies. It's a very, very dark story to be telling to what was predominantly a kids programme back in the very early 1970s, or through a lot of this classic era of the show. It's very much predominantly a children's show, and yet you're telling a story where a version of Earth that's like pretty much identical to ours is being completely destroyed and killed by molten lava, and everybody's dead. That's a really dark idea to go down, and it's just a very intriguing way to do things. So season 7 has 4 excellent stories, but I don't think it's a kind of was a model that they could ever really continue through several seasons, because it would have just turned Doctor in too much of a bleak and miserable programme, I think, when it's very much a hopeful and exciting and positive programme in general. So as much as I adore season 7, and it probably is my favourite season of Doctor Who of all time, it definitely was right for them to make the change they did going into season 8. And it's interesting with season 8 because season 8 starts with a very, very controversial opening story in Terror of the Autons, where the ideas of plastics are used again. It's the return of the Autons, and some very kind of the sort of troll doll idea, the idea of the Auton being a policeman, these very controversial ideas that got a lot of complaints at the time because they were kind of just pushing it over the line of what was acceptable on television on a children's programme like this back then. And yet the stories just don't really feel, I think, in the same way as dark as they did before, as they did in season 7, even if some of the contents are more controversial in early season 8 than we saw in season 7, which is just a very interesting change-up for the programme. Of course, one of the biggest things about season 8, and really the whole Pertwee era, is the introduction of the Master for the very, very first time. Played wonderfully by Roger Delgado. I'd probably say he's still my favourite incarnation of the Master to this day. Just the way he's such the brilliant, suave, evil villain. He's just got such a gravitas for the role, and he's got a great, just this kind of calm, evil persona that he's got, that it's such a sort of businessman-like way. This kind of very gentlemanly, upper-class, posh person almost, who's also a maniacal, evil villain, and could just sometimes let that side out of him. It's just such a brilliantly played performance, and I think him playing off Jon Pertwee is just so excellent across the board. All of their scenes are so captivating, and I always love to see him in a story.
Jenkins? Yeah. Shut for the wings there. 5 rounds rapid.
Letts acknowledged it, and I do tend to agree that it was probably a mistake to have the Master in every single story of season 8 because it just made it a bit too predictable that, oh, halfway through the story, yep, the Master's turned off again. You think about it, particularly in Colony in Space, I think he turns up in about episode 4 or something, and it's just that kind of typical thing of, oh, there's the Master again. I think it's episode 2 of Claws of Axos, and it's just, yeah, he keeps turning up in each story, which is a little bit silly, but I think you can kind of get away with it for one season, and it was done because Roger Delgado needed work and they loved his character, but I think they realised in retrospect it probably wasn't the greatest idea. And I think season 8 is a strong series. It's probably not quite as good as season 7 as a whole. I think Terror of the Autons is a pretty good story, probably not as good as Spear from Space, but still reasonably good. Mind of Evil is always one I've very much enjoyed. The Claws of Axos just hasn't really ever done it for me so much. I know it's quite a popular story generally, but I don't know. It is very well put together and visually very impressive, but as a story, I've just never been that engaged with it. Colony in Space is well known for being a little bit of a bland letdown of a story. The first time we go off-world, of course, in this era of Doctor Who properly for a story that's not set on Earth, but it's just done in a very bland grey quarry and just kind of makes it a little bit uninspiring. But then the Demons is a very, very strong way to finish the series. It's kind of, I think, the Doctor Who unit, Jon Pertwee unit era at its absolute peak in that story. I think the absolute pinnacle of it, when you've got all of the popular main characters of the Doctor, of Jo Grant as the companion, you've got Mike Yates, you've got the Brigadier, you've got Sergeant Benton, you've got the whole crew, you've got the Master as the villain in there as well. I think it was just that sort of one story which is kind of completely typifies the Jon Pertwee Third Doctor era, the unit era of Doctor Who. I think it's just the most perfect sort of example of that in a story, and it's such an excellent way to finish season 8. I probably should mention the companions as well, of course. We had Liz Shaw as the kind of main companion in season 7, but then she was dropped for season 8, in many ways because they realised she doesn't really work. It doesn't really work having a character who's almost equal to the Doctor, not in pure intelligence, but in a scientific way, so that then you don't get those basic questions being asked by the companion, because it wouldn't make any sense for Liz Shaw's character to ask those questions because she should already know the answer. I always really enjoyed her as a companion in season 7. I think she does an excellent job, and it's a really nice relationship she has with Jon Pertwee. But I can also understand why they decided to make that change for season 8, because they needed a companion who was a little bit more like the previous ones we'd seen in the 60s. Not one who's just there to scream, because Jo Grant definitely is a different companion on that. And as much as she does a little bit of that, like all classic Who companions do, she still feels like a fairly strong-willed character who very much believes in things and really throws herself into everything she possibly can. And I think that's really warming and endearing as a character for us to be able to enjoy, but it just means that she's that more accessible companion that we can really relate to, that I just don't think Liz Shaw quite was. And so it made sense, yeah, to move on to that for season 8, and it was great to have her for a full 3 seasons as well.
Your report?
We found and destroyed the enemy.
Any complications?
No complications.
Good.
Then season 9 of Doctor Who brought back the Daleks for the first time in 5 years in Day of the Daleks. We hadn't seen them since 1967 in Evil of the Daleks, so it was a pretty big moment, though ultimately it was a bit of a letdown of a story because they only had so few Daleks and the action scenes were very, very disappointing. But it was just that idea of having a hook at the start of each season to get people watching and interested. After you'd had new Doctor, you'd had new Companion and the Master, and then you had Daleks in season 9. And then the 3 Doctors special in season 10 and a new companion in season 11. So there was always that hook to keep you going through each series, the Jon Pertwee era, which I think really, really helped the show out. After that episode, we had the first Peladon story, probably the better Peladon story. One of those, it was very much a story that was unlike anything else at the time, really. A story that's completely set off Earth again, and a story that had so many different wacky aliens throughout the story. And it feels like a very kind of a pleasant change, I think, by that point in the era. As much as I was enjoying the kind of unit stories and the alien Earth-based stories and everything around that Master-based stories as well, it is nice to occasionally have that change and that variety. And I think that was important by this point in the show, in this era, to be able to have a little bit more of off-world, different things happening. I mean, let's use excuses of, oh yeah, the Time Lords made him fly off there or something like that. It was a little bit of a stretch, but they had to find ways to have stories off Earth because it just wasn't going to work keeping it purely Earth-based all the way. And definitely Curse of Peladon is a lot better than Monster of Peladon. And Curse is always a story that I've actually really, really enjoyed. I think just having all those different aliens and just the interesting plotline around it all, and just created a really, really interesting and engaging story that I've always, had quite a soft spot for. Then The Sea Devils, which is one of my probably all-time favourite Doctor Who stories. It's just always been one I've absolutely loved and adored. I think the naval base and sea sort of base setting is always a really, really interesting one for me. Having the Sea Devils as a great alien that, although it does to an extent retread some of the ground of Doctor Who and the Silurians, I feel like it does it to an extent a different way, and also introduces the Master into the plotline of this story as well. And some really interesting scenes between the Doctor and the Master when the Master is in prison, and just seeing the kind of relationship that the two of them have, where the Doctor still kind of cares about the Master in a very real way, and isn't just happy he's locked away and doesn't want to see him, wants to go and meet up with him, and he cares about him still. And so I just thought that was a nice initial exploration of their two characters' relationships that is very, very interesting and explored. And yeah, as I say, the Sea Devils are a very interesting villain. Some of such iconic moments when we see them coming up out of the water and into the minefields that the Doctor and Jo are sort of trapped with the Sea Devils is such a great scene, and it's just full of iconic moments, I think, that story, and why I love it so much. Then it has to be said the end of season 9 is somewhat of a letdown with the mutants and the time monster to close the season out. The mutants, of course, another off-world story set way out in the future and in another planet. It's just not a very, very exciting story, I think, is the best I can say about it. It was just probably one of the few stories of the Jon Pertwee era where I felt a little bit bored during it. It feels too long. It's just not a very, very engaging story that I was particularly buying into or interested in, which is a shame. And then the time monster, to an extent, continues on with that vibe. It at least has the change-up of us going to ancient times later in the story, which just mixes it up a little bit. But again, I just don't feel like it's that whole sort of ancient mythology thing just isn't really my interest particularly, which is probably to an extent why I enjoy it less. And by this point, I feel like it's just starting to get to that point where we're struggling for ideas with unit-based stories, and there's just less. They're starting to become a little bit less interesting, maybe.
Look.
Ah, there you are. I seem to be stuck up here. Oh, so you're my replacements. A dandy and a clown. Have you done anything?
Well, we've assessed the situation.
Just as I thought. Nothing.
Well, it's not easy, you know. Not as if we knew what that stuff is. No.
Then I'll tell you. It's a time bridge.
Is it what? I see.
Now, what's a bridge for, eh?
Well, crossing?
Right. So stop dilly-dallying and cross it.
Wait! You faded him again. I did not fade him. You saw him. You faded him.
I hate to ask, but who was that?
Me.
So then we have season 10, the anniversary season of Doctor Who for the very first time, their 10th anniversary, which of course started with the three Doctors featuring all three of Jon Pertwee, Patrick Troughton and a little bit of William Hartnell to create the three Doctors. A story that actually aired at the very, very end of 1972 / the start of 1973, so almost 11 months before the 10th anniversary. But it was all about the 10th anniversary season and all that, and they wanted to use it as the hook to start the season off again. And it is a fun story. It's not maybe necessarily the greatest story of all time, but it is just so brilliant to see that first ever kind of multi-Doctor interaction between Jon Pertwee and Patrick Troughton. They play off each other so well. And they've introduced the character of Omega, exploring a little bit more of the past of Gallifrey and the Time Lords. Unless the Time of Children changes all of that, of course. But yes, just looking into some of that for the very first time. The antimatter universe is such an interesting idea. The moment when we see Omega raise his helmet and realise that he doesn't exist anymore is just such a brilliantly horrifying and excellently executed moment. I really, really love it. And yet it does just feel like a really, really fun and great anniversary special, I think. The Doctor being given his comedian circuit and his understanding of time travel back, or whatever they explained it to be, meaning that he finally can go off Earth again and start off on adventures. And so we do see a fair amount of that in season 10. Of course, the next three stories from here, Carnival of the Monsters, Frontier in Space and Planet of the Daleks, are all set completely off present-day Earth, which is a really good, and I feel like the change up the show finally needed. Of course, we'd had basically 3 years at this point since the Doctor had been exiled to Earth back at the beginning of 1970 in Spirit from Space, right through until the Three Doctors, which aired at the very beginning of 1973. He's finally allowed to go away again and get off Earth properly, and they don't have to come up with silly explanations as to why he's being allowed to leave Earth on this occasion. It can just happen more naturally and organically. And yet, as I say, Carnival of the Monsters, that's an excellent story. It's such an interesting idea where it goes in ways you really don't expect it to. The real sort of twist, the surprise that we're inside a miniscope is just, I think, genuinely quite surprising and really, really interesting to explore. The Drashigs are really just a crazy, wacky alien villain that are also quite cool and interesting as well. And yeah, it overall just create a really exciting and a very interesting story to go straight off with the kind of first proper off-world story that's been allowed in this era, to then have it be such an interesting idea, I think is really, really excellently explored. Followed by, of course, Frontier in Space, which is sadly the Roger Delgado Master's final story, because, of course, he was tragically killed after they'd filmed this story, before he had any opportunity to film any more, in a car crash in Turkey when he was out filming another programme over there, which was a real shame and really, really sad. He was always, as I said, my favourite Master in the programme, and it meant he never really got the real send-off that he deserved, because it was a very messy, poorly edited final scene in Frontier in Space. It was a complete disaster because they didn't film it properly, and it just all went wrong, basically, in the filming process. And so it's completely confusing and a mess, and you don't really understand what's going on, which is a real shame after what is actually a really, really strong story. As much as there is a fair amount of escape catcher element to Frontier in Space, it is a story that I really enjoy personally. Introducing the Daleks in at the very end of the story as well to set up the next story is really, really fun, and just a really good way to do it, I think. But yeah, losing Roger Delgado's Master in that way and with such a disappointing ending was a real, real shame, I think, for the programme. Then Planet of the Daleks is a story that is kind of just a retread of all the previous Dalek stories. It's not bad, but it is just introducing loads of ideas that have been in previous Dalek stories and trying to mash it all together into a new one, which it's all right, but it's just nothing special, I think.
Quiet a moment. Now, well, here's to both.
Yeah, here's to both. For he's a jolly good fellow, for they are jolly good fellows, for they are jolly good fellows, and so say all of us. I'll get away. Ah, well, there you are.
But then I think the Green Death really is a special story for Doctor Who. It's probably the other example of unit Doctor Who at its absolute pinnacle. We've got all the main characters in there that we're used to and that we've loved over these few seasons. It kind of feels like, to an extent, the last hurrah for the proper unit era Doctor Who that we've grown to know and love, because it's the final story for Jo Grant as the companion, of course, in this story. And it really is the first properly emotional departure, I think, for Jo. For a companion in Doctor Who, we'd never really seen quite that level of emotion, really kind of playing it for the emotion, I think, for the first time, that just hadn't really been explored in the same way. Maybe with Susan in Dalek Invasion of Earth, but I think apart from that, it hadn't been quite the same up until this point. And so it's such a poignant and perfectly executed moment, I think, her final farewell. It really made sense with her character, and I think it just works excellently, and really is such an affecting moment to complete what is such a brilliant story, a very nostalgic story for myself, but also I think an excellently written story. There are all the big political messages in there. Yes, Doctor Who fans, there was political messages in the 1970s as well as today. It hasn't been only happening since 2018 or something silly like that. But I don't think it distracts from the story. It still creates an excellent story that's really, really enjoyable. And yeah, I think is kind of the first signs of the real end of this era of the show. So then we reach the final season of the Jon Pertwee era, season 11. By this point, Jon Pertwee's made the decision that he is going to be leaving at the end of the season. We also know that Terence Dix and Barry Letts, or certainly Barry Letts, is going to be stepping down at the end of the season. So that's another kind of change for the programme, and it's very much this era kind of starting to break up. We have the introduction of Sarah Jane Smith, Elizabeth Slade and Sarah Jane Smith as the new companion. She, of course, is instantly excellent. She's, as everybody knows, such a brilliant and wonderful companion, and you can completely see that straight away from the very beginning. She's such a very strong-willed character, I think even more so than Jo Grant's character. Really a much more kind of modern type companion, I think, to an extent. Yes, the screaming's still in there, as they always are, but I think more than ever this is a more modern type companion that we get in straight away from the beginning of the Jon Pertwee era, which is really interestingly explored. Even if I think after the first story it's almost kind of reined in a little bit, and she's given a little bit more screamy at points, which is a shame, because I feel like she did a really good performance straight off from the beginning there in The Time Warrior. A story which, of course, introduces the Sontarans, or a Sontaran for the very first time, what become quite an iconic villain for Doctor Who as well. Then with the last few stories, we go through Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which is another classic unit story, well, not classic story, but a unit story very much in the vein that we're used to, with some terrible model dinosaurs that really just do not look very good. But not a story that I think is terrible. It sets off the rather interesting Mike Yates story, where he kind of turns bad to an extent and joins this revolution where they want to go back to the Golden Age, and then means they can then bring him back in the Jon Pertwee's final story in a different way as well, which is all quite well done, I think. And then we get one final Dalek story for Jon Pertwee's Doctor, Death of the Daleks, which is somewhat of an interesting, different take for the Daleks, where they basically lose their power and their weapons, so they have to come up with new ideas and new ways of competing with, or sort of killing people basically and taking control. But ultimately, it's not one of the most exciting Doctor Who stories you've ever seen, and some of the cliffhangers in there are, quite frankly, appalling, which is a bit of a shame, really. And then Monster of Peladon, the final story before, well, the final off-Earth story for Jon Pertwee's Doctor, which again is not particularly great. It's a little bit overly long, I think. It's all about the sort of parodying of the miners' strike as well from the time. So going a little bit political there. Shocker for Doctor Who. Of course, Curse of Peladon was a little bit of a metaphor for the whole joining the European Union in the very first place back then. And yeah, so Monster of Peladon, it was a little bit of a disappointment as well. It's just overly long, and as much as it does introduce the Ice Warriors as the villain again, which is quite cool, it still just isn't the strongest of stories, I think. And so it brings us to Planet of the Spiders, Jon Pertwee's final story as the Doctor, which I think it's not a brilliant story, it's not a terrible story, but it does feel like it's time for the era to end by this point. They're trying to find different things to do with units and the whole Earth-based stories, but it naturally becomes more and more of a challenge with more and more story you've done like that. And so it does feel like, I think, the right time for the show to kind of have a proper change and a move on there. Jon Pertwee does put in, I think, a really good performance for his final story, him facing off against the Queen Spider right at the end, or the Great One even, I think, at the very end, when he has to kind of accept this, face up to his fears, which ultimately kill him, and he has to say goodbye. In what is an extremely emotional final scene for the Doctor as well, I think it very much, again, is the kind of first proper sign of a very emotional farewell for the Doctor. We see Sarah Jane having a tear, and of course the Doctor's immortal final lines as well. It's just, I think, a perfect scene and a perfect way for the Doctor to bow out. And then that's it, with a pretty poorly executed crossfade. Tom Baker becomes the Doctor. The sting for the titles comes in, and that's it. Jon Pertwee's Doctor is over and done with. And so overall, it's an era that I think personally I really enjoyed. There's so many strong stories throughout each season. Probably season 11 is maybe the weakest season of them all, I think. Season 9 and season 11 are probably the two weaker ones, but certainly season 7, 8 and 10 are three excellent seasons of Doctor Who, with season 7 being the absolute pinnacle. And overall, it's just been a really fun era to watch again, and certainly so far I'd say it's my favourite era of Doctor Who, but you never know, I might watch the Tom Baker era all over again and realise that's my favourite now. We'll have to wait and see. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Do let me know in the comments below all your thoughts on the Third Doctor's era, your favourite stories, your favourite moments, your favourite monsters, anything about the Third Doctor's era. I'd love to hear it down in the comments below. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I'm going to try and maybe do some Tom Baker reviews at some point. I'm not sure which episodes or which ones I'll review at the moment, but there may be some of those coming up in the future. If there's any stories in particular you'd like to see me review, do let me know down in the comments below about that as well. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. As always, hit that like button, that subscribe button if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for another brand new video. Goodbye.
Oh, Doctor, why did you have to go back?
I had to face my fear, Sarah. I had to face my fear. That was more important than just going on living.
Please, don't die.
A tear? Sarah Jane? No, don't cry. While there's life,
Look, Brigadier, look! I think it's starting.
Well, here we go again.